Hello, my name is Tramble, and I'm going to talk about my final research and analytical paper about how finance in higher education affects low-income minority students. So some of the challenges that are faced by low-income minority students are discriminatory admissions processes or policies. I'm going to cover some of those, and then the funding cuts to financial aid, the state funding in particular, and then the lack of overall support in institutional policies that sometimes affect these students. So some of the changes in enrollment are going to affect the low-income minority students in the coming years. Um, and so from the research, based on the Higher Education Demand Index, it's a economics like forecasting model for higher education and what populations are going to be coming into higher ed over the next few years. There will be a small increase in the early 2020s of higher education bound college students, but after that there is going to be a decline of 15%. And so institutions are going to have to find a way to make up for that drop somehow. And so a big part of that drop is going to come from white students, that they're going to decrease by 15% over the next 10 years. And so these institutions are going to have to find a way to recruit and retain low-income minority students, because those are the populations that are expected to grow tremendously almost everywhere in the United States, to make up for that smaller population of white students. So the financial issues that I focused on in the paper were the SAT and ACT, and how to take those exams costs money, right? And so a lot of low income students and minority students specifically don't have the money to take those exams. They also cost to prep for those exams. So even if they can find the money to take the exams, they're not as prepared for them because they're not able to afford the preparation classes, tutors, and all of that for it. So in the research, Cybersyn stated how minority students don't tend to perform as well on the exams and therefore are discouraged from attending post-secondary education, and they tend to have the average or below test scores, and then even if they do okay on them, are only encouraged to apply to 2-year schools versus 4-year schools, and then told that they can transfer from the 2-year school to the 4-year school if they basically make it through that. So then the way that the test looks at students is if you do really well, you're considered bright and you're just automatically encouraged to apply to a prestigious 4-year school or a big state college, and so and you're told that without even considering what your academic performance is in high school. So this test has a lot of is heavily weighed on for college admissions, and that definitely affects low-income minority students. The other financial issue is the list price versus the actual price, that we talked about in class and read in our books. And we talked about the tuition discounts that, again, low income students are typically given, and then the financial aid and financial aid cuts that have happened over the past few years. But the scholarships and grants that these students are also given, and then the merit-based aid, where we focused a lot on, and we saw in our reading that Georgia was focused on with their merit-based aid with the Hope Scholarship, but again, that scholarship is discriminatory against low-income minority students who may not perform as academically well in high school. So some implications for policy are the cuts in funding that higher education has experienced over the years, especially from the states, and for states to stop doing that and realize how important higher education is to them. Something that I pointed out in the paper was that states should be investing in higher ed because these are the students who are going to be graduating and getting jobs most likely in their states and paying the income taxes back in that first job to the state. So that's something that is important for states to keep in mind. Some changes to the SAT and ACT requirements. A lot of schools are moving away from requiring this test, and if the test doesn't uh, actually show some kind of actual assessment of the student, is it actually being used and proven that it's showing that it's making a difference, that students with higher SAT scores graduate faster, persist longer, have higher GPAs once they get to college, anything like that. If there's not proof to show that, then why are we requiring it? And then I talked a lot about a book that is called The Privileged Poor by Anthony Jack, and basically in his book he talks about a specific private school in the Northeast that he works at, and the low income minority students that are recruited and fully paid for by this institution, but then he interviews them and talks to them about the issues that they encounter while they are on campus, even though their college is fully funded. And so one of the things was closed dining halls during winter breaks and spring breaks when they don't get to go home because it's such a short time period, because they can't afford to go home, but yet they have nowhere to eat because they close all the dining halls on campus, and that forced them to become creative and sometimes even starve themselves. On-campus jobs that pay more money tend to be the more lower looked at jobs, and so basically these students end up cleaning up after their classmates in their dorms and their bathrooms, and the jobs were just very demeaning and disheartening to them. And then attending on-campus events where, for classes, or, a speaker comes and it costs money for a ticket. So these low-income minority students didn't have the money to pay for these tickets. So the school instituted a policy where they give them so many tickets a semester that they can use to go to the events. But the problem is that they have to go to a separate line and almost be called out in this separate line that's in the back somewhere. And so just making some adjustments while these things support the students, just looking at these policies and see how they can be better used to support these students. So some future resource is to assess the admissions policies and make sure that there is an actual reason for, using the SAT and ACT, and double checking on financial aid for the growing populations, and figuring out the ways that we can continue to increase that for students, and then to provide better support for students, and be willing to adjust and change institutional policies that may affect these low-income minority students. And these were my references that I used for the paper. Thanks.